The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think there's any question. You go anywhere in this country, and the American people believe that this town in Washington and this institution in particular need a major overhaul. You know, the Founding Fathers conceived of a system in which individual Americans, individual citizens would stand for election, and then they would go up as representatives of the people, but they were no better than the people. They didn't live under different rules than the rest of the people. They were not part of a ruling class, but really part of a servant culture, and that was the ideal. Well, we've come a long way. Washington, D.C. is really the bane of the existence for many, many people in our society. It hinders our economy. You have people here who engage in self-dealing, and it's not acting consistently with how this system was envisioned. And so there are a lot of things I'd like to do. You know, I think Congress needs to be forced to live under all the laws they pass and enact on other people. I think you need to get rid of a lot of the perks that members of Congress get, including pensions for members of Congress. But I think if there was one thing that I think really cries out for reform, we need to have term limits for members of Congress. I don't think there's any way you're ever going to be able to overhaul this culture unless we do that. You know, there was a time when people would get elected in the founders. They didn't think anyone would want to be here that long. You know, you'd go, you'd serve, then you'd go back and live under the laws that you had passed and continue your pursuits as a citizen. Well, somewhere along the line, that really changed, and then people come up, and it's almost like that's the main thing that they focus on, is just staying here, sometimes in perpetuity. So you have people that, 40, 50 years, and I don't think that that's turned out well for our country. I think if you had term limits, I think you'd really open up the process for new blood. I think people would come in here with reformer spirit, new ideas, and really be part of a reform movement in Washington, D.C. It's often said, well, gee, yeah, you term limits, but the American people, they get their choice. They get to vote in the election. The fact of the matter is the way that our electoral system works, millions and millions of Americans have no functional choice, simply because maybe their district is only going to elect someone from one party. Maybe you have the power of incumbency that just makes it so that challengers are never going to be able to get traction. The whole campaign finance system is orchestrated to benefit incumbents. So we don't really just have where the American people have a choice. I think you have a structured choice, which typically leads to only one outcome. And so I'm not really somebody that thinks that this is all just the American people are so happy that people are getting returned here all the time. And another, I think, objection that some people have said for term limits is that, well, gee, if you term limit people, you have new people in who don't necessarily know how the system works. It's just going to be all the staff that are going to run it or the lobbyists that are going to run it. I got news for you. That's pretty much what happens already. I mean, a lot of these omnibus bills, those get done by staff behind closed doors. Staff wields a lot of power on these committees, and these are not elected individuals. Many of them work hard, and I respect a lot of them, but they are exercising in many ways authority that should be exercised by the members themselves. And so I think that problem is real, but I think it's already here. And I think if you had new people coming in, I think a lot of those people would probably want to bring in some of their own staff that would be more reflective of their ideas and principles rather than rely on here a long time, who really become accustomed to a system that's not working very well. And so I'm proud to have co-sponsored the bill to enact term limits on members of the House and members on the Senate. We do 3 terms for the House and 2 terms for the Senate. So if someone wants to serve in the House and serve in the Senate, they could serve 18 years. That's a long time, and I think you'd be able to really do some good things during that period. But I think what it does is it really shifts the focus of somebody that comes here, because right now, if you get elected to the House, you're on the low end of the pecking order in terms of seniority. I mean, you almost have to just sit around here for 10, 15, 20 years to be in a position where you could really make a huge difference. And so I think what that does is that creates a culture in which people want to stay here, and that's kind of the main thing that happens once you get here. I think if you had term limits, I think the main thing that people would be thinking about is, okay, you know, your term limited, your time is limited. Let's make the most of that. And I think you'd see a lot of people really perform much better. You'd have people who could come in as freshmen and have more of an impact because the system wouldn't be dominated by seniority. There'd be less favoritism, less backroom dealing. So I think it's a very positive reform. And you know, we've been voting on random things here lately. I think it would be great if we could come here and offer some reforms of the system, constitutional reforms like term limits, like a balanced budget amendment, like an amendment making Congress live under the laws that everybody else does. I think that'd be a breath of fresh air for the American people. And here's the thing, you know, we talk about how we have the division and the rancor in our politics and even in this institution. But you know, if you look, term limits is something that regardless of party, regardless of ideology, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of race, Americans support in overwhelming numbers. And so I think that's an example of where the American people are actually very united for this. But when you have the governing class in Washington, that's where the divisions are, because many people, you know, don't want to see those types of reforms here. But there is agreement throughout American society. And so if we want to start having a more unified country, we should be listening to the American people when they're speaking loudly and consistently over 20, 25 years that the term limits is something they want. We should heed that call, and we should be voting on that, and we should enact it, passing it out of the House, passing it out of the Senate, and then sending it to the states for ratification. What a win-win it would be, both for this institution to show the American people we're listening, but then obviously it would be a very positive reform to have